Okay, before we get started with this episode, I actually have something to say about the name. So the name of this episode is Bubbles of the Opera, and I get it, the outfit she wears later is a reference to Phantom of the Opera, even though the face mask is on the wrong side, but that's really more of a nitpick. But yeah, there's no opera in this one, so naming it in that specific way is a bit misleading. I feel like a better name for this episode, just kind of off the top of my head, would be Phantom of the Powerpuff. That works much better. But you know what? Whatever. Again, really just kind of small things in regards to the name thing. I just think if it were called Bubbles of the Opera, there should be some kind of theatrical element to it to sort of justify the opera name, using the opera part of Phantom of the Opera as opposed to the Phantom, because Bubbles is the Phantom. She's not of the opera, really. Let's just get into the review. The first half of the episode is pretty much Bubbles' descent into madness. But there's some things I don't really like about the way this sequence plays out, and yes, this means I'm going to be going into those lapses in logic again. So the setup is that Bubbles is cute. They get a replacement photographer who took a bad picture of Bubbles that we never see. But actually I'm okay with that because of the fact that we see what she looks like immediately when the camera flashes. Although according to the dialogue, it's worse than Buttercup's, which... no. I mean, if what we saw turned into something worse, I'd like to see that, honestly. I think it'd be very important to see that. Of course, the problem comes when we find out that there will be no retakes because the photographer was fired. So why can't they just hire someone else to do the retakes? I mean, they already replaced one photographer in order to get the pictures done in the first place. Surely they can replace this one to get the retakes done. And if it was outsourced to a different studio or whatever, then that's even more reason that there should be a replacement photographer. Especially if they fired that studio or they said, hey, your photographer is shit. And they're like, oh, we'll send you a new one for retakes. My bad. In fact, it would be more necessary to do retakes. I mean, honestly, the thing is, there's no indication that throughout the characterization of this character in the entire episode that she was fired for anything other than incompetence. So what the fuck? Oh, but wait, then the girls wouldn't have an excuse to take Bubbles to get a bad haircut. Except they would. Because the firing could just delay the retakes. It would change like one or two lines. You wouldn't be changing the length of the episode and you'd be getting rid of the inconsistency in the continuity of the episode. Good job. After an allergic reaction to some makeup, we get a bit of dialogue showing the intent behind this episode. Bubbles is concerned that her no longer being the cute one detracts from her personality in a major way, while the professor reassures her that her personality is much more than being the cute one. Now, I do agree with that sentiment, and I'm not going to rule out the possibility that they're using this as a way to sort of take a pot shot at her portrayal in the original show being one-dimensional, even though, you know, I kind of trust the press of this show. Not very much. Let's just say I can't throw buildings, and I trust the press about as much as I can throw Cartoon Network Studios. So... yeah, but I'm not willing to rule it out. And there is a problem if that is the way this is intended to be taken. You see, the problem with that is that Bubbles from the very first season of the original Powerpuff Girls was always hardcore. Now, of course, it's also possible that this is being levied at the complaints that Bubbles' character has been dumbed down as well as the other girls. And I would like to note that it's actually very possible here because based on what number of episode this is, this could have very well been in production when the first, one or two episodes had already aired and people were already saying their thoughts on the show. And I would agree with them on this point, but there is one thing I'd like to note. Yes, the character does have depth, but I would argue that most of the time, it's not the right kind of depth that I really want to see. However, I'm going to be making the case in this episode that the depth displayed in this episode is the right kind of depth that I really wish there was more of in the previous episodes. So Bubbles gets her teeth knocked out by a ceiling fan and... wait a minute. point blank nuclear level explosion, just a broken leg. Nearly point blank explosion, you know, granted you were being protected by the stupid wooden arm things, but just soot all over you. You know, no real damage there. Ceiling fan, you lose teeth. Is it too much to ask that the show is consistent with how much damage the girls can take? I mean, I understand them being less durable than in the old show. I understand that perfectly. I'm okay with that. But can you at least be consistent within your own show? Thanks. Bubbles goes crazy and runs away. And this is where the bratty nature of Bubbles' character actually works in her favor. We see the progression of her mindset into sort of running off, and things are given more time to progress naturally to where, honestly, Bubbles feels like a character who is going through emotions. The pacing in this episode is much better, and that's why it works so much better than in, say, Tiara Trouble. So, yeah, I think there's more time given to let things resolve more naturally, although I will point out that this episode doesn't entirely resolve things in a way that I would necessarily enjoy. So Bubbles goes to Mojo because she's like evil and junk now. Although I think it's worth noting that there's a small detail that shows that she's not actually truly evil, and it actually makes me like the ending a little bit more.
And maybe even destroy those accursed Powerpuff Girls.
What did you say?
Oh, nothing.
What this indicates to me is that Bubbles isn't as outright evil as what it sounds like when she offers to join up with Mojo initially. And actually, something interesting about that could have been a very cool place to put an interesting role-reversed parody of the song Phantom of the Opera from Phantom of the Opera, thus including the musical theater elements that I was asking for. You know, instead of having a persuasive mentor and a reluctant student, you instead have the reluctant mentor in Mojo Jojo and the persuasive student in the form of Bubbles, because we've seen that Bubbles can be very persuasive. And again, I'm trying to figure out how to pace this episode properly, and I think that's something I'm going to get into in my final thoughts, actually. I'm trying to figure out how to pace this episode properly in order to allow, like, even a minute to be used for a musical number, but I'm having trouble finding where I can cut things. You know, perhaps a couple of sequences could have been cut down a little bit, but I don't think we'd really get enough for a full musical number. Anyway, Bubbles commands a bunch of fucking animals to attack Townsville. And I gotta say, featuring Bubbles using her powers in a more evil and less controlled way is an interesting take, and it actually shows something that I wish was a little bit more present in this episode. You know, if you're out to more individualize the girls, as the press says that you are, but again, I don't necessarily believe the press, but if you're out to do that, why not give them more unique power sets? I mean, there's already kind of a baseline for this in the show itself. As shown here, Bubbles could command animals to assist her in superhero stuff, Buttercup's powers could be more martial than the others, and Blossom probably should have been the only one to get lantern powers in the first place. I mean, if this episode is about how Bubbles has depth of personality now, it's very important to show that depth of personality in full here. But I do feel like people wouldn't really complain about you pigeonholing the girls into modern cartoon archetypes if you actually did something with their powers that sort of reflected their depth of personality a little bit more, you know what I mean? So Dark Bubbles stops the other girls with Snake and is about to drop a hippo on them. Okay, honestly, I'm willing to accept the snake thing because, you know, one thing I've noticed about this series at this point is that if the girls are bound up, if their arms cannot move, then they cannot use their super strength. So, you know, that's actually something that is a continuity with the series. That is something that is consistent with how their powers work. Fair enough. But question, why would Bubbles pick up a hippo to drop on them instead of, I don't know, maybe commanding the hippo to step on them, or command the elephant that's right over there to step on them? Actually, you know what? Better question. Why would that even kill them? I mean, harping back on the other thing, I mean, I'd like to remind you that Blossom and Buttercup did survive point-blank explosions, but You know what? I do like the fact that they're still being consistent with the super strength doesn't work while their arms are bound thing. I don't know. Maybe Bubbles talking to animals thing is magic. I guess. I don't. What is their weakness? What is their weakness that makes them, like, not be super durable? It's clearly not explosions. Anyway, super dramatic scene of both sides trying to convince her what to do. Hippo on Mojo. There's really nothing else important about this episode except for one thing. Can we just get this as the new permanent look for Bubbles? This episode is not great. I can see why some people would be pissed off at this episode because of the potential for it to represent sort of a pot shot at the original series. However, I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I do think that the writers should be allowed to do what they want to do with these characters, but I would like to bring that in the other direction, though. If you're going to do what you want to with these characters, you should really feel inclined to go all the way with it. You should feel inclined to be able to give these characters some new powers. That way it just feels like, and if this is supposed to be a continuation, then it shows more progression with them having more individualized powers. Even if it's not supposed to be a continuation, it certainly gives it more of an identity from the original series. And you know, there were problems that I saw immediately, but I do feel like they did, for the most part, what they could with their 10-minute time slot. And I think really the only major solution to the problems I saw would be to just, you know, make this one a two-parter. I don't think that would be too much of a stretch, would it?